Breaking. President Ouattara forced to resign. Military takes control. In a move no one saw coming, President Ouattara is out, and the military is in. Here's what really happened. What just happened in Ivory Coast is shaking the entire continent. Ouattara forced to resign, and the army just took over. The streets erupted, the pressure mounted, and then President Ouattara stepped down. Who's pulling the strings behind this power shift? This is not just a resignation. It's a revolution. The Ivorian military has just redrawn the political map. Ouattara thought his grip on power was unshakable, but the army had other plans. Find out how it all unfolded. In a dramatic turn of events, President Alassane Ouattara has officially resigned from power following intense pressure from the Ivorian military leadership. This unexpected move signals a major shift in Ivory Coast's political landscape, raising questions about Africa's future leadership, military governance, and the growing wave of anti-imperialist revolutions sweeping across West Africa. What led to Ouattara's resignation? Who is the new military leader in charge? Is this a new beginning for Ivory Coast or the start of more instability? Watch the full video to uncover the truth behind the resignation, exclusive footage, public reaction, and what this means for Ivory Coast, ECOWAS, and France's influence in Africa. President Ouattara forced to resign. Recent posts on X, particularly from May 21st to 23rd, 2025, claim that President Alassane Ouattara, who has led Ivory Coast since 2011, was forced to resign following a military coup. These posts allege that Ouattara, described as a French-backed leader, fled the country amid a military takeover, with the streets of Abidjan filled with soldiers signaling a revolution. For example, one post states, "In the dead of night, the streets of Abidjan filled with the sound of boots, not celebration, but revolution," while another claims, Alassane Ouattara has been removed by the military. These sources also mention disrupted internet access, suggesting an attempt to control information flow during the alleged coup. However, these claims remain unverified, with no corroborating evidence from official government statements, mainstream media, or international organizations like the United Nations or ECOWAS as of May 25, 2025. Ouattara, aged 83, has faced scrutiny for his extended tenure, particularly after running for a controversial third term in 2020, which opposition groups argued violated constitutional term limits. His party, the Rally of Houphouetists for Democracy and Peace, RHDP, urged him to seek a fourth term in 2025, citing his leadership as essential for stability. The absence of confirmed reports of his resignation or a coup suggests that these ex-posts may reflect rumors, disinformation, or aspirational narratives from anti-imperialist groups rather than factual events. Historically, Ouattara came to power with French military support during the 2010-11 post-election crisis, which may fuel perceptions of him as a neo-colonial figure, amplifying calls for his removal. Until credible evidence emerges, claims of Ouattara's forced resignation should be treated as speculative, possibly reflecting regional anti-French sentiment rather than a confirmed political shift. Ivory Coast political crisis. Ivory Coast has a history of political volatility, notably the 2002-04 and 2010-11 civil wars, driven by disputes over electoral legitimacy and ethno-regional divisions. The alleged 2025 coup, as described in X posts, would mark a significant escalation in the country's political crisis, potentially reviving tensions from these earlier conflicts. Posts claim a military takeover occurred, with Ouattara's removal tied to his perceived alignment with France and accusations of constitutional manipulation. These claims align with historical grievances, such as the 2010 election crisis, when Laurent Gbagbo's refusal to concede defeat led to a civil war, resulting in 3,000 deaths, and Ouattara's installation with French and UN support. The current alleged crisis lacks verified details, but it could stem from several factors. First, Ouattara's controversial third term in 2020, enabled by a 2016 constitutional reform that he argued reset term limits, sparked protests and violence, killing dozens. Opposition leaders, including Henri Konan Bedai and Gbagbo, labeled the move unconstitutional, fueling distrust. Second, Ivory Coast's economic inequalities, despite strong GDP growth under Ouattara, have bred resentment, particularly among the urban youth and northern populations who feel marginalized. Third, regional instability, including coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, may inspire similar actions in Ivory Coast, especially given accusations that Ouattara supported destabilizing efforts against Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré. Without official confirmation, the crisis remains speculative, but it reflects deep-seated issues of governance, legitimacy, and foreign influence that continue to shape Ivorian politics. Military takeover in West Africa. West Africa has experienced a wave of military coups since 2020, earning the Sahel region the moniker Coup Belt. Mali, 2020-2021, Burkina Faso, 2022, Niger, 2023, and Guinea have seen military takeovers, often justified by deteriorating security, government inefficiency, and anti-French sentiment. The alleged coup in Ivory Coast, reported on X in May 2025, would align with this trend, with posts claiming the military seized power to end Ouattara's rule and French influence. These coups share common drivers: jihadist insurgencies overwhelming state forces, economic hardship, and perceptions of neocolonialism, particularly tied to France's military and economic presence, in Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's 2022 coup ousted Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, citing his failure to address jihadist attacks. Similarly, Niger's 2023 coup removed President Mohamed Bazoum, with the junta accusing France of destabilization. If the Ivory Coast coup claims are true, they could reflect similar motivations, given Ouattara's historical reliance on French support and accusations of his involvement in plots against neighboring juntas. However, Ivory Coast's economic and political weight as West Africa's largest cocoa producer and a regional hub makes a military takeover particularly destabilizing, potentially triggering refugee flows and economic disruptions across the region. The lack of verified reports suggests caution, but the regional pattern of military interventions underscores a broader rejection of civilian governments perceived as ineffective or foreign-aligned. African leadership changes. Africa is undergoing significant leadership transitions, driven by a mix of democratic processes, coups, and generational shifts. In West Africa, younger military leaders like Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré, aged 34 in 2022, contrast with older civilian leaders like Ouattara, 83 in 2025, reflecting a push for new voices amid frustration with entrenched elites. The alleged Ivory Coast coup, if confirmed, would represent a dramatic leadership change, replacing Ouattara with a military junta aligned with anti-imperialist goals. This mirrors trends in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where juntas have gained public support for challenging foreign influence and promising security. Beyond West Africa, leadership changes vary. In Senegal, President Bassirou Diomaye Faye, elected in 2024 at age 44, represents a democratic shift toward younger, reformist leaders advocating sovereignty. In contrast, countries like Cameroon and Uganda face criticism for long-serving leaders clinging to power, fueling calls for change. The Ivory Coast situation, though unverified, highlights tensions between generational aspirations and established power structures. Ouattara's potential fourth-term bid, despite earlier promises to retire, has stoked fears of prolonged rule, potentially triggering the alleged military response. These changes reflect a continent-wide demand for leadership that addresses youth unemployment, security, and sovereignty, though military takeovers risk entrenching new forms of authoritarianism. Anti-imperialist movements in Africa. Anti-imperialist movements are gaining traction across Africa, particularly in Francophone West Africa, driven by resentment of historical colonial powers, especially France. In Ivory Coast, ex-posts frame the alleged 2025 coup as a rejection of Ouattara's French puppet status, aligning with broader regional movements. Burkina Faso's Traoré, Mali's Assimi Goïta, and Niger's Abdourahmane Tiani have similarly positioned their coups as anti-imperialist, expelling French troops and canceling military agreements. Ivory Coast's decision to withdraw French forces in January 2025, announced by Ouattara, was framed as a step towards sovereignty, though critics argue it was a superficial move to mask ongoing French influence via 1961 military agreements. These movements draw on historical grievances, such as France's role in the 2010-11 Ivorian crisis, where French forces helped Ouattara oust Gbagbo. The concept of Ivorite, used to exclude Ouattara from elections in the 1990s, has evolved into broader anti-French sentiment, with Gbagbo's supporters and others viewing France as a manipulator of Ivorian politics. Across the Sahel, anti-imperialist rhetoric resonates with youth frustrated by economic inequality and insecurity, though it risks oversimplifying complex issues. For example, while juntas criticize France, their reliance on Russian or Turkish support raises questions about new forms of foreign influence. In Ivory Coast, the unverified coup claims may reflect this anti-imperialist fervor, but their credibility remains uncertain without official evidence. ECOWAS silence on military transitions. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has faced criticism for its inconsistent response to military coups in West Africa, with its alleged silence on the reported Ivory Coast coup amplifying perceptions of ineffectiveness. ECOWAS has historically condemned coups, as seen in its suspension of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after their respective takeovers, imposing sanctions and demanding a return to civilian rule. In the 2010 Ivorian crisis, ECOWAS recognized Ouattara as the legitimate president and threatened military intervention against Gbagbo, though it relied on French and UN forces to act. The lack of reported ECOWAS statements on the alleged 2025 Ivory Coast coup, as noted in X posts, could reflect several factors. First, the claims may be premature or false, with no official coup to respond to. Second, ECOWAS's credibility has been weakened by the withdrawal of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger to form the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, accusing ECOWAS of being influenced by foreign powers. Third, Ivory Coast's economic and political significance may make ECOWAS cautious, fearing regional destabilization or retaliation against its citizens in Ivory Coast. ECOWAS's past interventions, such as in Sierra Leone, have been controversial, and its reluctance to act decisively in recent coups suggests logistical and political constraints. If the coup is confirmed, ECOWAS's silence could further erode its authority, signaling a decline in its ability to enforce democratic norms. France's declining influence in Francophone Africa. France's influence in Francophone Africa has waned significantly, driven by anti-colonial sentiment and regional shifts toward sovereignty. In Ivory Coast, Ouattara's January 2025 announcement of French troop withdrawal was presented as a move toward national progress, with the 43rd Bima base handed to Ivorian forces. However, critics, including the Revolutionary Communist Party of Ivory Coast, PCRCI, argue that France retains influence through 1961 military agreements and smaller bases in Assaini, Bouak, and Korogo. Similar expulsions of French forces in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and Senegal reflect a regional trend, with leaders like Traoré framing their actions as resistance to neocolonialism. France's historical interventions, such as bombing the Ivorian presidential palace in 2011 to support Ouattara, have fueled resentment. French President Emmanuel Macron's 2025 remarks, claiming Sahel countries owe their sovereignty to French interventions, further inflamed anti-French sentiment. X posts alleging an Ivory Coast coup link it to France's declining influence, with claims that Ouattara's removal ends French occupation. However, France's strategic shift to less visible military presence, such as counterterrorism schools and mobile bases, suggests an attempt to maintain influence covertly. While anti-French rhetoric drives anti-imperialist movements, the presence of US and Russian forces in the region complicates the narrative, indicating a shift rather than an end to foreign influence. Conclusion: the alleged forced resignation of President Ouattara and a military coup in Ivory Coast, as reported in unverified X posts from May 2025, reflect deep-seated tensions in Ivorian and West African politics, but lack corroboration from credible sources. The potential crisis ties into Ivory Coast's history of electoral disputes and ethno-regional divisions, exacerbated by Ouattara's controversial tenure and perceived French alignment. The wave of military takeovers in West Africa underscores regional instability, driven by security failures and anti-imperialist sentiment. African leadership changes highlight a generational shift, with younger leaders and juntas challenging entrenched elites. Anti-imperialist movements are reshaping Francophone Africa, with France's influence declining amid accusations of neocolonialism, though new foreign actors like Russia complicate the landscape. ECOWAS's apparent silence on the alleged Ivory Coast coup, if true, signals its weakening authority. Until official evidence confirms these events, they should be approached with skepticism, viewed as part of a broader narrative of resistance, instability, and geopolitical realignment in West Africa.